They tell you civilization started around 5,000 years ago. Writing, cities, laws, the wheel. They hand you a clean little timeline in every school book on Earth, and they say this is where it begins. But then you go to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and you find T-shaped pillars carved from single blocks of limestone, some of them 5 meters tall, some of them weighing 20 tons, arranged in perfect circles, covered in animals you have never seen on any temple. Foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes. And the carbon dates come back, 12,000 years old. No pottery, no farming, no writing. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by almost 8,000. And suddenly that clean little timeline you memorized in school starts to crack. These people were not supposed to know what they clearly knew, and the stone is still there to prove it. This is the story of what prehistoric stone sites are actually telling us. The astronomy, the engineering, the calendars locked in rock, the knowledge that someone went to enormous effort to preserve in the hardest material available because they needed it to last. Knowledge we used to teach, lost somewhere along the way, and are only now beginning to read again. If you value deep, documented history like this, the kind that uses real sites, real dates, and real archaeology, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. This script draws on research from the journal Antiquity, including a July 2024 paper by Martin B. Sweatman, published in the Taylor and Francis group titled Representations of Calendars and Time at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe Support an Astronomical Interpretation of Their Symbolism, peer-reviewed science, not speculation, and a June 2025 breakthrough study by Audrey Blanchard, Bettina Schultz-Paulsen and colleagues in that same journal, Laplasker and Plow-Harnell, which just rewrote everything we thought we knew about European megaliths. Now back to the story. Southeastern Turkey, 1994. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt is walking across dry hills near the ancient city of Urfa when a local man named Mahmut Yildiz leads him to a mound. Schmidt had been reading a Chicago and Istanbul University report from 1963 that dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery. But Schmidt had just finished excavating a smaller site called Navali Quarry. He knew what he was looking at. He cleared the first stone, then another. Then the circles began to emerge from the earth. He sent the dating results back to the lab. Between 9,000 and 10,000 years before the Common Era. He told a colleague, "We are 6,000 years before the invention of writing here. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, Belly Hill in Turkish. It sits at an elevation of about 760 meters in the Gurmis mountain range of Upper Mesopotamia. When Schmidt's team mapped the entire summit using ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys, they found at least 16 megalith rings still buried across 22 acres. The 1-acre excavation completed before Schmidt's death in 2014 covered less than 5% of the site. Let that sink in. Everything that changed archaeology was less than 5% of what is there. Pillars arranged in circles, 10 to 30 meters in diameter. The tallest of the central T-shaped monoliths are 5.5 meters high. Some weigh close to 50 tons. They were quarried from limestone bedrock about 100 meters from the hilltop using only flint tools. Schmidt calculated, using Thor Heyerdahl's experiments with Easter Island statues as a reference, that moving a single pillar of this weight would have required between 50 and 75 people working for a full week. Some estimates suggest that carving each pillar alone took 20 people a year. This was hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated wheat, who had no pottery, who used stone tools, and they organized the labor of hundreds, quarried and transported multi-ton stones, and built something that archaeologists have now spent 3 decades calling the world's oldest temple. But the real question is not whether it is a temple. The real question is what these people knew that required this kind of effort to record. Look at Pillar 43, the one called the Vulture Stone. It stands in Enclosure D, and it is covered in carved reliefs. In 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritses published a paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry arguing that Pillar 43 is an astronomical map. Their interpretation, which Sweatman extended in a peer-reviewed July 2024 paper in the Taylor and Francis Journal, is that the symbols encode a lunisolar calendar system using 11 additional days, which would make it the oldest known calendar of its type. The V symbols carved into the pillar can be interpreted as markers, tracking the relationship between the solar year and the lunar year, accounting for the roughly 11-day gap between a 365-day solar year and 12 lunar months. This is not a simple system. A culture that understands this gap and builds a stone device to track it is doing something we usually associate with Bronze Age civilizations, not with people scraping flint 12,000 years ago. The same study notes that Göbekli Tepe's 11-pillar enclosures and a megalithic 11-pillar pool structure at nearby Karahan Tepe can both be interpreted in terms of the same lunisolar system. 11 is not a random number. The paper notes the orientation of the enclosures in relation to stellar events around 10,500 years before the Common Era. suggesting the builders were tracking where specific stars rose and set, and encoding that knowledge into the physical layout of the site. Karahan Tepe is about 35 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe. It was discovered in 1997 by archaeologist Bahattin Çelik of Harran University, but full excavations only began in 2019 under Professor Necmi Karl of Istanbul University. As of 2023, roughly 5% of its 10-hectare site had been excavated, and what they found in those 2023 digs stopped the archaeology world cold. In September of 2023, excavators at Karahan Tepe uncovered a 75-foot wide new enclosure near the hilltop. Inside, a 2.3-meter tall statue of a man, the most realistic human depiction ever found at a site of this age. You can see his ribs, his spine, his hands resting on his legs. He is seated in a posture that archaeologists describe as suggesting an altered state or a ritual role. Beside him, a vulture statue with precisely sculpted wings. On the northern wall, a giant circular hold stone set between two large T-shaped pillars. Then, in October 2025, Karul's team lifted a 135-centimeter pillar upright and discovered something that had never been found before, a human face carved directly onto a T-shaped pillar with a prominent nose, deep-set eyes, and a sharp jawline. The art newspaper reported Karul's words directly. The only missing element in this pattern was the face. These pillars were always human. They represent people, or something in between people and gods. Karahan Tepe also contains what Karul called one of the most monumental and earliest examples of phallic symbolism, a chamber in the bedrock with 11 giant carved forms, watched over by a bearded head with a serpent body emerging from the wall. 11 again. The same number as in the enclosures tied to the lunisolar calendar. Whether this is coincidence or code is a question that archaeologists are still arguing. But when the number repeats across structures from two different sites, 65 kilometers apart, built by people with no writing, no metal tools, and no pottery, you start asking different questions. These are not primitive people drawing random shapes. They are communicating something precise, raw, carved, watching. Now leave Turkey, travel west. Roughly 4,000 years later in calendar terms, you arrive at Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England. About 3,100 years before the Common Era, people begin digging a circular ditch roughly 110 meters in diameter out of late Cretaceous chalk. The chalk they removed was piled to form a bank. Inside the outer edge of that enclosed area, they dug a ring of 56 pits. These became known as the Aubrey Holes, named after the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey who first recorded them. Each pit is roughly 1 meter deep and 1 meter wide. At least 25 of them contained cremation burials in the centuries after they were dug. Whatever the Aubrey Holes were first built for, the dead were placed in them, which is itself a statement about how important the people doing the burying considered the structure. Stonehenge grew from those early holes and banks across roughly 1,500 years of construction. Around 2,600 years before the Common Era, builders transported 80 dolerite bluestones from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 200 miles away. A peer-reviewed study published in Antiquity in February 2019 identified the specific quarries, Carn Godog and Craig Ros Eifelin, both more than 200 miles from Salisbury Plain. Those 4-ton stones were moved across water, over hills, through marsh. Decades later, builders added the sarsen stones, the large outer ring. Each one stands about 4 meters high, 2 meters wide, and weighs around 25 tons. They were sourced from Marlborough Downs, about 25 miles away. The whole outer ring is made of these sarsens, joined with mortise and tenon joints, woodworking joinery applied to stone. There's not another example of this technique in any contemporary monument on Earth. In 2024, Historic England published research led by Clive Ruggles, Emeritus Professor of Archaeoastronomy at the University of Leicester, and archaeologist Amanda Chadbourne. The study, compiled into a book published by Liverpool University Press on May 8th of that year, used computer simulations and field observations to confirm what astronomers have suspected for decades. Stonehenge's central axis aligns with midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. The 4 station stones, an outer ring of stones that most visitors barely notice, mark the southernmost moonrise and northernmost moonset during major lunar standstills. These are not approximate alignments. The terrain's specific contours, the gentle slope of Salisbury Plain itself, was part of the design. In 2024 and 25, a major lunar standstill occurred for the first time in 18.6 years. Teams from Oxford, Leicester, and Bournemouth universities watched what happened. The moon set exactly where the station stones point. The stones still work. Gerald Hawkins, the American astronomer who first studied Stonehenge computationally in 1963 using an IBM 7090 mainframe, argued in his landmark book Stonehenge Decoded that the 56 Aubrey Holes were an eclipse predictor. Lunar eclipses repeat in a pattern that relates to the Saros cycle. 19 plus 19 plus 18 equals 56. If you track where the moon is in this cycle using markers in 56 holes, you can predict when eclipses will occur. British cosmologist Fred Hoyle expanded this hypothesis in the 1960s. His mechanism was essentially a stone-based analog computer. Move a marker one hole per day, and the system tells you when the shadow of the Earth will touch the moon. Critics, including archaeologist Richard Atkinson, dismissed this as impractical in 1966. The debate continues, but the 56-hole number remains, and the lunar periodicity explanation remains the most mathematically rigorous one offered. What is not disputed is this. The bluestone horseshoe at the center of Stonehenge originally contained approximately 19 stones. 19 is the Metonic cycle, the number of solar years it takes for the sun and moon to return to nearly the same positions relative to Earth. This was declared a discovery by the Greek astronomer Meton of Athens in 432 years before the Common Era. Stonehenge's inner horseshoe predates that by roughly 2,000 years. Either the Neolithic builders of Salisbury Plain independently understood an astronomical cycle that the Greeks celebrated as a major discovery, or we need to seriously revise our idea of what was known and when. Ill, human, bone? Go farther south, the Mediterranean. Roughly 700 kilometers south of Rome, in the middle of the sea, sits Malta, an island roughly 275 square kilometers, smaller than many cities. On that island, between 3,600 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, a culture archaeologists call the Maltese Temple period built structures so sophisticated that UNESCO describes them as unique architectural masterpieces. There are over 50 major megalithic sites in Malta and neighboring Gozo, crammed into 320 square kilometers. 50 sites in a space smaller than a mid-sized American county. The most precise of them is Menajdra. It sits on the rocky southern coast, made of hard coralline limestone, and it consists of 3 conjoined temples built across different centuries. The earliest dates to around 3,600 years before the Common Era, the latest to around 2,500. The lower temple is the one that arrested every astronomer who ever visited. On the morning of the spring equinox, at sunrise, the light enters through the main doorway and travels in a straight line down the central axis to the innermost niche. Exactly the same thing happens on the autumn equinox. On the summer solstice, the sun's first rays illuminate the edges of specific megaliths to the right of the doorway. On the winter solstice, the same effect occurs on megaliths to the left, all 4 annual turning points. Measured and built in stone around 5,000 years ago. Archaeoastronomer Tore Lomsdalen spent years studying this and published a full analysis in his 2014 book, Sky and Purpose in Prehistoric Malta, Sun, Moon, and Stars at the Temples of Menajdra through Sophia Center Press. His conclusion stated plainly, the orientation of the temple towards the equinox sunrise is too precise to be merely coincidental. Separately, researchers examining the pillar at the entrance to one of Menajdra's inner apses found rows of drilled holes, between 90 and 168 holes depending on the pillar surface. In research published in the Journal of Skyscape Archaeology, a statistical investigation found that the number of holes corresponds, with a probability of less than 1 in 700, to the intervals between heliacal star risings visible from Malta around 5,000 years ago. In other words, someone drilled those holes in a specific sequence to track when specific stars rose just before dawn across the span of a year. It is a tally system. It is a star calendar cut into the side of a stone pillar. The probability that this arrangement is random is 0.14%. The Menajdra builders also apparently tracked a stellar cycle spanning 18 years, the observation period needed to identify the full pattern of the moon's behavior from a fixed location. Hagar Kim, the neighboring temple a few hundred meters away, has what researchers call an oracle hole, a precisely shaped elliptical opening in one wall that illuminates a specific interior spot on the summer solstice sunrise. Together, the 2 temples form what Heritage Malta's official literature now describes as an accurate solar and lunar calendar. These structures were working. They were information devices. They were doing something we would call science. South, desert, bone. Leave Malta and go to Africa. Take a map of Egypt and find the Nile. Now go 600 miles south and 100 miles west into the Nubian desert of southern Egypt to a place called Nabta Playa. The site is about 800 kilometers south of modern Cairo at 22.5, 1 degrees north, and 30.73 degrees east. Today, it is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But starting around 9,000 years before the Common Era, the monsoons of Central Africa shifted north. They brought seasonal rain, they filled a lake bed, and people came. Fred Wendorf, an anthropology professor from Southern Methodist University in Texas, discovered the site in 1974. He found potsherds sticking out of the desert sand and recognized what he had. He returned over the following decades. In the early 1990s, Wendorf excavated with Polish archaeologist Romuald Schild, and from the sand emerged a circle of stones, small stones by Stonehenge standards. A circle only 4 meters across, made of quartzite sandstone brought from an outcrop about 1 kilometer away. But their arrangement was not random. Wendorf spent 7 years unable to explain the alignment. Then, in 1997, he brought in J. McKim Malville, a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado and a specialist in archaeoastronomy. Malville and the team spent time at the site in person. The results were published in the journal Nature in 1998. The stone circle aligned with Arcturus, Sirius, and Alpha Centauri. 3 interstanding stones corresponded to the 3 stars of Orion's belt. A line of larger stones extended outward toward specific stellar risings. Tracing Arcturus's movements backwards through precession, the team calculated that the star's alignment with the circle dated to around 4,800 years before the Common Era. That makes it the oldest astronomical site we've ever discovered, Malville told Discover magazine. The analysis was confirmed in a follow-up study by Malville, Schild, Wendorf, and Brenmer published in African Sky in 2007. 4,800 years before the Common Era. That is 2,000 years older than Stonehenge's first construction phase. It predates the pyramids by more than 3,000 years. The people who built Nabta Playa were nomadic pastoralists who came to this lake bed in summer. When the summer solstice arrived, they could read it in the stone circle, specifically because the solstice coincided with the arrival of the monsoon rains, the water that kept them alive. Understanding the sky was not mysticism, it was survival infrastructure. Astrophysicist Thomas Brophy, in studies published through the 2000s, extended the analysis and argued that the 6 inner stones were a scaled model of Orion, encoding the correct angular distances between the stars. This interpretation is contested. A 2007 rebuttal from the original Wendorf and Malville team questioned his stellar distance calculations. But the basic alignments, solstice, Sirius, Orion, Arcturus, are accepted. What Nabta Playa shows at absolute minimum is a nomadic culture tracking the solar year and multiple stellar risings from a fixed observation point 7,000 years ago. The original stones of Nabta Playa's calendar circle are no longer at the site. After researchers published their findings in 1998, tourists began visiting and moving the stones. The main stones are now in a museum in Aswan. The information they contained is preserved. The site itself was altered by the very act of being understood. Star, circle, gone. Now go north, past the Mediterranean, past France, into the windswept coast of Brittany in northwestern France. The town of Karnak. More than 3,000 standing stones originally, stretched across 10 kilometers of coastline between Karnak and Erdeven, arranged in the most complex pattern of megalithic alignments known to archaeology. 4 major types. Alignments, long rows of standing menhirs, some stretching half a mile, tumuli, individual burial mounds, dolmens, stone tombs built from massive upright slabs, and enclosures, megalithic circles. The Grand Menhir of Ergra, before it fell in prehistoric times, stood 20.6 meters tall. And the jade axe heads found in the burial mounds were traced by geologists to sources in the Alps and northern Italy, transported by boat across the Bay of Biscay. Oceanic travel, not coastal. These Neolithic farmers were crossing open ocean. For centuries, no one knew when exactly Karnak was built. Brittany's alkaline soils destroy organic material. Standard techniques had not yielded reliable dates. Then in 2025, a paper was published in Antiquity under the title Laplasker and Pluharnal, 5th Millennium Cal BC, a newly discovered section of the megalithic complex of Karnak. Lead archaeologist Audrey Blanchard of Archaeodunum and the University of Gothenburg, working with Bettina Schultz-Paulsen, used Bayesian modeling of an unprecedented series of radiocarbon dates on charcoal from the foundation pits of standing stones and associated hearths. The results? The Karnak alignments at Laplasker were constructed between 4,600 and 4,300 years before the Common Era. That makes this section of Karnak among the earliest megalithic monuments in Europe. Schultz-Paulsen stated, "The alignments in the Karnak region now appear to be among the earliest megalithic monuments in Europe. We have confirmed the Bay of Morbihan as the earliest megalithic region in Europe." In 2023, a minor cultural scandal hit Karnak. A DIY chain called Mr. Bricolage was opening a store in town. To do so, it cleared a field of ancient stones, 39 of them, some dating back 7,000 years. Archaeologists issued statements. Politicians expressed concern. The residents largely shrugged. The mayor said the stones had low archaeological value. He had signed the building permit without knowing the site was listed on the Heritage Atlas. 39 megaliths, older than the Egyptian pyramids, cleared for a hardware store because the knowledge of what they were had long since stopped being taught. Build, remember, forget. Now let us take a step back and look at what these sites share. Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old, pillars in precise circles. The oldest carved megaliths in the world, astronomical symbols, intentionally buried. Karahan. Tepe, 11,000 years old, human figures with realistic anatomy, chambers carved from bedrock, 11-pillar structures potentially encoding a lunisolar calendar, intentionally buried. Stonehenge, 5,000 years old, 56 holes corresponding to an eclipse prediction cycle, 19 blue stones corresponding to the Metonic cycle, outer ring aligned to solstice, station stones marking the lunar standstill. Still working. Nabta Playa, 7,000 years old, aligned to Sirius, Arcturus, Alpha Centauri, and Orion, marking the summer solstice. Nidra, 5,000 years old, 4 astronomical alignments built into one structure, plus a star tally calendar and drilled holes with a statistical probability of randomness under 1.5%. Karnak, 6,000 years old at its oldest confirmed section, 3,000 plus stones in aligned rows across 10 kilometers. Earliest megalithic culture in Europe, as of 2025 dating. Every one of these sites is tracking time, specifically the movement of the sun and moon, the positions of stars, the cycles that govern seasons, agriculture, tides, and navigation. Every one of them requires precise, long-term observation to build. You cannot align a structure to the summer solstice sunrise unless you have spent years watching where on the horizon the sun rises and marking the extreme northward point. You cannot encode a lunisolar calendar in a pillar circle unless you have already counted enough years to know how many extra days accumulate between the solar and lunar year. You cannot track the heliacal rising of Sirius unless you know exactly what time of year it first becomes visible above the horizon before dawn, which requires watching it from the same location across multiple years. This is systematic, intergenerational sky observation encoded in stone because stone lasts when teachers die. The engineering speaks too. The dolmen of Menga in southern Spain, built between 3,800 and 3,600 years before the Common Era. 32 limestone rocks weighing a combined 1,140 tons. One single capstone, 150 tons. A study published in Science Advances, led by Leonardo Garcia San Juan of the University of Seville, found that the builders understood load distribution, arch mechanics, and progressive engineering methodology similar to modern structural science. Still standing after 6,000 years of rain, wind, and earthquakes. The researchers' conclusion was direct. There would be no engineer today who would be able to build this monument with the resources available 6,000 years ago. Precise, deep, permanent. Here is the question that follows. If these people understood lunisolar calendars 12,000 years ago and tracked stellar distances 7,000 years ago and encoded the Metonic cycle and a lunar eclipse predictor 5,000 years ago, what happened? None of this knowledge survived in documented form into the classical period. The Greeks rediscovered the Metonic cycle. The Babylonians independently developed eclipse prediction. Meton of Athens in 432 before the Common Era was celebrated for a discovery that Stonehenge's builders had used 2,000 years earlier without leaving a written explanation. The builders of Nabta Playa abandoned the site permanently by 3,000 years before the Common Era when the Sahara dried out again. The Maltese temple period ended abruptly around 2,500 years before the Common Era. The temple culture disappeared, and the knowledge of why the temples were aligned went with the people who left. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried around 8,000 years before the Common Era. Karahan Tepe was similarly backfilled, as you would a person who has died, in Carul's words, buried properly. This is how knowledge dies, not in one catastrophe, in attrition, in the gap between the person who understood the system and the child who was supposed to be taught it but was not, because war, famine, plague, migration, or simple institutional collapse came first. The stone remains. The explanation dies. What survives is the physical hardware of a knowledge system, the instrument without the manual, the observation without the theory, the data without the interpretation. Every generation since has tried to read the manual from the instrument. We are still doing it now, using satellite GPS surveys, Bayesian radiocarbon statistics, three-dimensional simulation software, and computational astronomy, and we are still finding things we missed. In July 2024, Antiquity published new confirmation that Göbekli Tepe encoded a lunisolar calendar system 12,000 years ago. In June 2025, Antiquity published the first precise radiocarbon dating of the Karnak alignments. The stones are releasing information faster now than at any point in the last 300 years of archaeology, because finally we have tools good enough to ask the right questions. And what the stones are saying is simple. The people who built these places knew what they were doing. They knew it precisely. They invested generations of observation, enormous quantities of labor, and their finest engineering skills in preserving that knowledge in the most permanent medium available. Not clay, not wood, not skin. Stone. They chose stone because stone outlasts everything. We are standing in the middle of the long silence now, the gap between when the knowledge was cut into limestone and when we finally learned to read limestone well enough to hear it. But here is what archaeology found in 2023 at Karahan Tepe that closes the story. 46 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, in that new enclosure opened at the top of the hill in September 2023, below the vulture statue and beside the 2.3-meter ribbed man, excavators found a carved stone plate on the floor, flat, shaped, placed precisely between the central statue and the enclosure wall. No one has yet published a definitive interpretation of what it encodes. It is one of thousands of objects at a site that is still 5% excavated. But the pillar above it, the one with the face, uncovered in October 2025, was carved with a deep-set nose and jaw and eyes. Professor Nekmi Karul described it at the site as unique and abstract evidence of self-expression by the people of the period. The face was staring outward from the stone. It had been facing the same direction for 11,000 years. It was not waiting to be found. It was already keeping watch. Stone, face, 11,000 years. The knowledge is in the stones. We just stopped looking long enough to forget it was there. Now, there is something else that deserves your full attention. Something the mainstream conversation about these sites almost never mentions. Every one of these sites was built to last, not for a generation, not for a century, for thousands of years. The builders were not making temporary structures. They were making permanent ones, and they clearly knew the difference. The sarsen stones at Stonehenge, analyzed in a 2021 study by researchers from the University of Brighton, the British Geological Survey, and English Heritage, were found to be composed of interlocked silica crystals, so tightly bound that the material is practically indestructible. The study, published following analysis at the Natural History Museum in London, described the sarsen as an extraordinarily hard rock. This is not the stone you use if you are building for your own lifetime. This is the stone you use if you are building for your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren. The blue stones at Stonehenge's inner ring tell a related story. Archaeological evidence confirms they were transported from Wales over 200 miles away. The question that matters is not just how they were moved, but why those specific stones. Why travel 200 miles for dolerite when you are already quarrying harder sarsen locally? One theory, proposed by archaeologist Tim Darvill of Bournemouth University as early as 2005, is that the blue stones were considered to have healing properties. In the decades since, signs of illness and injury in the human remains, found at and near Stonehenge, analyzed by British archaeologists, have led researchers to describe the site as a possible prehistoric Lourdes, a pilgrimage destination for the sick. The bones of people who were clearly not local, identified by isotope analysis, have been found in the burial grounds surrounding the monument. People were traveling long distances to be at Stonehenge specifically, not just to participate in its calendar function, to receive something it was believed to provide. This layering of function is visible at Menajdra too. The temple's astronomical precision is established, but the site also contained flint knives, rope holes interpreted as animal restraints, and the scattered bones of sheep and goats, sacrificial activity. Stone benches and stone tables that Heritage Malta's literature interprets as possibly having a medical function. The celestial alignment and the healing practice in the same building. The calendar and the sacrifice at the same moment. These are not separate institutions. They are one institution. The sky knowledge and the ritual knowledge and the medical knowledge were held by the same people in the same place. Look at Göbekli Tepe again. Schmidt's team found no cooking hearths, no permanent houses, none of the standard domestic refuse of a settlement in the earliest layers, no clay fertility figurines. What they did find were the bones of wild animals in enormous quantities, the remains of large communal feasts. Gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, red deer, groundstone tools suggesting large-scale processing of food on site. Limestone vessels, some capable of holding up to 400 liters, interpreted by researchers as fermentation containers, possibly for brewing. Klaus Schmidt and his colleagues described the site as a religious gathering place where hundreds of people from across the region converged repeatedly, not to live, to gather, to feast, to observe, and then, apparently, to build. The social infrastructure required for Göbekli Tepe is itself a form of hidden knowledge. Before farming, before permanent settlement, before any of the organizing technologies that archaeology used to say were prerequisites for complex society, the builders of Belly Hill coordinated the labor of what Schmidt estimated to be hundreds of people, fed them, housed them temporarily, provided them with tools and materials, and sustained the project for at minimum hundreds of years. The oldest sections of Göbekli Tepe date to around 9,600 years before the Common Era. The most recent, before the intentional burial, to around 8,000 years before the Common Era. That is at minimum 1,600 years of active use and construction. Multiple generations, multiple leaders, multiple workers who never lived to see the project finished. Whatever system of authority and belief kept this going for 1,600 years was itself a form of knowledge that is now completely lost because it was never written down. At Karahan Tepe, the situation is even more striking. The site was occupied continuously for approximately 1,500 years, between 9,400 and 8,000 years before the Common Era. Sacred and secular spaces were built simultaneously. Circular rooms carved from bedrock existed alongside residential structures. Professor Karul of Istanbul University, speaking about findings presented in 2021, described the organizational complexity directly. Building multiple structures with different purposes is the reflection of a complicated belief system. It is not possible to talk about religion in its true sense, but we see a set of distinct, limited rituals that are radically set forth. 1,500 years of continuous habitation at a site that was eventually buried on purpose. When the site was backfilled around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the inhabitants did not abandon it carelessly. They sealed it methodically, covering the enclosures with deliberate fill, preserving the carvings. They knew it was ending. They preserved what they could. The decision to bury Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe tells you something. It tells you the builders considered the structures to have a completion, that they were not eternal things, but vessels for a specific moment of knowledge. And when the moment passed, or when the knowledge needed to be passed on in a different form, the vessel was sealed rather than allowed to fall into ruin. This is not the behavior of people who did not understand what they were doing. It is the behavior of people who understood precisely what they were doing and who made a deliberate choice about how it should end. We call them prehistoric because they left no written records. But the absence of written records does not mean the absence of knowledge. It means the knowledge was stored elsewhere, in stone, in physical alignment, in the angle of a doorway, in the depth of a carved groove, in the specific number of holes drilled into a pillar. The knowledge was stored in the most durable format available to people without writing, and it was stored with enough redundancy across enough sites and enough centuries that we are still finding new layers of it now. We started this story in southeastern Turkey on a dry hill in 1994 with a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, looking at stones that nobody had considered worth studying since 1963. We end it in the same place, in a sense, because the story of what these sites tell us about knowledge we no longer teach is ultimately a story about what happens when a discipline stops asking the right questions. Archaeoastronomy, the field that actually studies how ancient people understood the sky and encoded that understanding in their buildings, is, as Historic England's own published research notes, rarely taught in the United Kingdom. Even in countries where it is taught, it sits at the margin of archaeology departments as a somewhat contested discipline. Most archaeologists who visit Stonehenge know about the summer solstice alignment, but as Clive Ruggles observed in the Historic England publication of May 2024, would be hard-pressed to elaborate further. The sophistication of what the Stonehenge builders encoded, the 56-hole eclipse predictor, the 19-stone metonic cycle, the station stone lunar standstill markers, is not common knowledge. It is not in the tourist guide. It is in academic journals that most people never read. The result is that millions of people visit these sites every year and experience them as mysterious, as beautiful, as old, without understanding what they were for. That ignorance is not inevitable. It is the result of a decision made over many generations to treat prehistoric knowledge as primitive, to assume that complex understanding was impossible without writing, and to stop asking what the stones were actually saying. The stones have been patient, 12,000 years patient. The faces at Karahan Tepe stared outward from the stone for 11 millennia before anyone looked back and recognized them for what they were. The drilled holes at Nidra tracked star risings across 5,000 years of Maltese winters before a statistician calculated the probability that they were accidental and came up with 0.14%. The Aubrey holes at Stonehenge sat in their chalk pits for nearly 5,000 years before Gerald Hawkins fed their geometry into an IBM mainframe and extracted an eclipse cycle. In October 2025, a team of archaeologists at Karahan Tepe lifted a 135-centimeter pillar into its upright position for the first time in 11,000 years and found a human face. The nose was prominent, the eyes were deep set, the jaw was sharp, the face had been carved facing a specific direction and had maintained that orientation through every century of burial without anyone to watch over it. Professor Necmi Karl, speaking to the art newspaper at the site, said it plainly. This example provides clear evidence that the T-shaped pillars symbolized humans. It is a unique and abstract example of the self-expression of the people of the period. And then he added the line that closes everything. Similar finds further define the cognitive transformation people underwent during the Neolithic Age. Cognitive transformation. The moment when human beings became capable of abstraction, of representing themselves, of encoding ideas about time and the sky and death and ritual into permanent physical form. The moment when knowledge became something you could store outside a human mind. something that could outlast the person who first understood it. That moment did not happen 5,000 years ago. It did not happen with writing. Based on everything Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe have shown us, it happened at least 12,000 years ago on a hill in southeastern Turkey by people we once called primitive, who built the first known human monument and covered it with carvings of the sky. 11,000 years later, the face they cut into that pillar is still looking outward. It always was.